Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the ECPR series on Middle Eastern policy and EU relations. My name is Christos Kourtelis, and I am an assistant professor in European public policy at Panteion University in Athens. Now we get well into 2026, and the series continues to build on its initial aim, launched in response to concerns within the academic community following the conflict in Gaza and the challenges to academic freedom faced by affected scholars and students. It remains dedicated to fostering an informed and nuanced academic debate on the cultural, economic, and political dynamics shaping Middle Eastern societies and their interactions with the wider world, offering a sustained platform for balanced and meaningful discussion. The first discussion of our 2026 series is devoted to Iran. We are delighted to welcome two distinguished speakers who will examine key dimensions of the country's domestic political dynamics and foreign policy. Our first speaker is Professor Azadeh Kian, Professor of Sociology at the Université de Paris. Professor Kian is a leading scholar in political sociology and gender studies, with an extensive publication record that includes numerous books and peer-reviewed articles. She's the director of the Center for Teaching, Documentation and Research for Feminist Studies and the editor of the journal of Sedref journal. Her deep expertise on Iran's political landscape and the social movements offers valuable insights into the country's current developments. In her 15 to 20 minutes presentation, Professor Kian will explore whether and to what extent recent protest movements have transformed state-society relations in Iran. She will also address how the Iranian regime manages this societal dissent and civil society activism while preserving institutional resilience. As you heard, she wrote a book about it. We have current developments in the country, and she can reveal us about Iran's hybrid or adaptive authoritarian system. Azadeh, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Our second speaker is Professor Daniel Brumberg, who teaches at Georgetown University. Professor Brumberg is a widely recognized authority on political and social change in the Middle East and the broader Islamic world, and the author of numerous influential books and articles. He has also served as an advisor to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Fundamentalism Project, the Global Democracy Program of the US Agency for International Development, and the National Democratic Institute. Following Professor Kian's presentation, Professor Brumberg will devote approximately 15 to 20 minutes to analyzing the foreign policy of dimensions of Iran's current situation. In particular, he will discuss the position of the current US administration, if it is easy to decipher, towards Iran, and examine how domestic power struggles within Iran shape its foreign policy choices. A brief note to the audience, please submit your questions via the chat box. I now have the pleasure of passing the floor to the co-coordinator of the series on Middle Eastern policy and EU relations, Dr. Assem Dandashly, who is associate professor at Maastricht University. Assem, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Azadeh and Daniel, for joining us today. And thank you all for joining this important webinar on Iran's domestic political landscape and its foreign policy implications during times of uncertainties. And as we speak, things are changing by the minute, basically. Iran today stands at a critical juncture, if we can put it that way. Internally, widespread protests have gripped the nation, driven by economic hardship, political frustration, and demands for greater reforms and freedoms. Externally, Tehran is facing intense pressure from powerful actors on the global stage, and mainly the United States. Understanding Iran's foreign policy and position in isolation from these internal dynamics or these geopolitical pressures offers only a partial view. Our discussion today insists that to make sense of where Iran is headed externally and also internally, we must first understand the complex domestic political forces shaping its decisions. Recently, protests have spread across different provinces in Iran, with estimates suggesting thousands of casualties as the security forces have responded with excessive force. These protests began with economic discontent, but quickly moved into broader demands for political change, signaling deep-seated grievances with the political system and economic mismanagement. At the same time, the international context in which these protests unfold is anything but neutral. The US and Israel have taken highly visible positions, not just in rhetoric, but in strategic posture. Donald Trump has repeatedly issued stark warnings, tweeting that the US is locked and loaded and ready to go if Iranian security forces continue to kill protesters, and has publicly suggested that help is on the way. Such statements go far beyond diplomatic concern for human rights. They play into a long history of external pressure aimed at reshaping Iranian politics. Critically, this isn't a new dynamic. The Trump administration's foreign policy toward Iran has been characterized by an aggressive posture since its withdrawal from the nuclear agreement during his first term as a president. That policy, colloquially known as maximum pressure, reimposed comprehensive sanctions and intensified diplomatic isolation, inflicting severe economic strain on the Iranian population. These measures have had devastating humanitarian effects, contributing to unemployment, inflation, and shortages of essential goods, even while boasting to constrain Tehran's nuclear ambitions. What is less often acknowledged in policy discussions is how this strident external pressure mirrors earlier US foreign policy patterns that prioritize coercion over diplomacy, often at the direct expense of ordinary people's livelihood. The rallying cry of maximum pressure may be justified in strategic parlance, but it has real consequences for everyday Iranians grappling with economic insecurity and political repression. When sanctions deepen hardship, they can inadvertently fuel social discontent, not against the regime alone, but also against foreign governments perceived to be indifferent at best and hostile at worst. The handling of the current protests illustrates the complexity and dangers of this approach. Some analysts note that both the Iranian government and the Trump administration have treated protesters as leverage in a geopolitical game, framing domestic dissent as either a threat to be crushed at home or an opportunity to justify foreign intervention from abroad. From this perspective, Iranian protesters find themselves caught between state repression and external political agendas, neither of which genuinely centers their aspirations for self-determination. There is parallel dimension to this dynamic involving Israel. Israel has framed Iran as its existential adversary for decades and has loudly endorsed calls for regime change. In recent months, Israeli leaders have publicly expressed support for Iranian protesters and hinted at intelligence cooperation or influence operations under the surface. Critics argue that this engagement is not simply supportive in a humanitarian sense, but serves the strategic goal of destabilizing Iran's political order to advance its own security interests. Some analysts go further, contending that Israel and the US have been actively exploiting the protesters through coordinated media campaigns and diaspora networks to shape narratives of regime collapse and push political outcomes favorable to Western allies. In this view, the protests are not merely a spontaneous expression of domestic dissent, but have become entangled in a broader regime change architecture that amplifies external agendas. This framing is not intended to deny the real grievances of Iranian protesters, who have legitimate demands rooted in their lived experience, but it complicates how we should interpret external involvement. Importantly, such external posturing also carries dangers. Speculations about possible US or Israeli strikes, including all the what we hear about it, has raised serious concerns among scholars and policy observers. The risk is not only only escalation into broader conflict, but that violence will be justified on the basis of moralistic language about supporting freedom, even when strategic interests predominate. This echoes historical cases where geopolitical objectives were masked as humanitarian interventions, often with tragic outcomes for local populations. What unifies these issues, sanctions, protests, external rhetoric, is that they demonstrate how deeply internal and external politics are intertwined in Iran. Domestic protest movements, whether driven by economic despair or demands for civil liberties, are interpreted abroad through the prisms of strategic rivalry and ideological contestation. Meanwhile, global powers frequently advance their own agendas under the banner of democracy promotion, even as their actions often exacerbate instability or erode prospects for autonomous civic mobilization. For analysts of state-society relations and authoritarian governance, these developments raise critical questions that our speakers will tackle today regarding the external-internal dynamics, what's happening in Iran. And today's webinar will precisely shed light on these issues that concerns not only us in the Middle East and North Africa, but also in Europe and in the world. We will explore these questions, and without further delay, I give the floor to Azadeh.
Yes, thank you very much, Assem and Christos, for inviting me. I'm very, very honored to be here. My talk actually starts with the Women Life Freedom Movement of 222-223, which actually accelerated the erosion of the Islamic regime's political, ideological, and religious legitimacy, and caused an ever-widening rift between the Islamic State and the population, because Islamic laws and institutions that reinforce social, ethnic, gender, and religious inequalities were challenged precisely because they contradict social realities and new social, demographic, cultural, and political behaviors, particularly among younger generations, women and ethnic and Sunni minorities who are particularly discriminated. Nonetheless, the 12-day war in June 2027, the Israeli and American attacks on military and nuclear installations, and the assassination of several high-ranking military officers and Revolutionary Guards commanders did not elicit massive support from the population for either the regime or Israel, contrary to Netanyahu's expectations. Despite the severe repression suffered by Kurdish and Baluch activists and other opponents, they defined themselves as Iranian and shared with other peoples of Iran a concern for preserving the integrity of the country and its population. So following this June war, any act of opposition is accused of spying for Israel and severely punished. Just to give you an example, Narges Mohammadi, who is the Nobel Prize winner in 2023, was arrested and imprisoned again in December with 39 other activists, and she is labeled by the regime as Israeli pawn. These Israeli attacks, which were most likely aimed at overthrowing the regime, were therefore detrimental to Iranian civil society. I do believe that it really weakened the organized Iranian civil society. However, the regime has been increasingly challenged because of its incompetence in managing crises on all fronts. We have a massive brain drain phenomena in Iran. We have economic crisis, that is important unemployment, poverty. Over 50% of the population is now below the poverty line. An important inflation, and also a very important corruption. Then there are other problems such as drought, which is also in part linked to the frenetic construction of dams or water-intensive agriculture and so on. Then there is electricity shortages and important pollution. And this made many experts to believe that these all threaten the very existence of the country. So these are all also, it's not just economic crisis, this is all of these ecological, political, and so on crises that triggered also the anger of the majority of the population. So debates, of course, were provoked on ecological, economic, and other domestic and foreign affairs issues after the women's rights freedom movement, and a lot of academics, former even or current diplomats and officials participated in these debates, and many also criticized the way foreign affairs were being conducted by the Secretary of State, Mr. Araghchi, for lacking initiatives, vision, perspective, and so on. So this all, what happened, intensified divisions within the regime over the policy to be adopted in order to control the protesters and to avoid a new social movement and strengthen the regime. This was in some months after the Israeli attacks. Prior to the current protest movement, the ultra-conservatives, supported by the leader Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards, the militia or vigilant groups, who are highly repressive, they wanted to control the society through highly repressive means, whereas presidential team preferred more flexible methods. And finally, to give you just one example for this is that the Iranian parliament voted for a very harsh law against women who are unveiled or badly veiled, as they put it. But then the president Pezeshkian decided not to apply the law, saying that it will create further tensions within the society. So this was a response to the pressures from an active and determined society. Because women who reject the compulsory veiling, it's not just a question of the veil, but of freedom of choice and freedom in general. And this issue of freedom exists in Iran ever since 1906, the constitutional revolution, and it is a demand that we hear for it, Azadeh, in all social movements. So a growing number of Iranian women attempt to take control of their destiny, including their bodies and sexuality. They transgress Islamic norms, some of them, and through performative acts refuse to conceal their new rebellious bodies. Michel Foucault once said that we called it escaping disciplinary power of a surveillance regime. So this is precisely what's happening nowadays in Iran. Despite repression and economic crisis, they sing, dance, and proclaim the urgency for freedom. And as you might know, Gilles Deleuze, a French philosopher, pointed that power requires sad bodies. Power needs sadness because it can dominate it. Joy, therefore, is resistance. And indeed, everywhere, we see cultural resistance was organized after women's rights freedom movement. People gathered spontaneously in the streets to sing, dance, and proclaim freedom. And these are society's attempts to stay alive in the face of a regime of annihilation, of repression, death, and mourning. And it shows the resilience of life against death. Today, even today, after the Hosh massacre, people who mourn their beloved ones killed by the regime dance and chant at their funeral as an act of resistance. So despite the harsh repression of women's life freedom movement, over 650 young people were killed, Many more were injured, and you know that they shoot to their eyes. So a lot of these young people, women and men, lost their eyes. Again, in December 225, January 226, Iranian protesters have once again taken to the streets in many cities across the country to voice their anger against a dictatorial, incompetent, and corrupt regime, which is responsible for all these crisis. And they aim directly at the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and his regime, because the slogan that was chanted all over Iran was done with Khamenei, down with the dictator. The country, of course, has seen several social movements. For instance, the Green Movement of 2009 against electoral frauds, then economic movements that draw the working classes in the streets in 2018 and 2019, following the tripling of gas prices and gasoline prices, and cultural and political movement of women rights freedom in Iran. But the current uprising in the country is unprecedented because it was triggered by bazaar merchants, the beating heart of the economy, who are conservative and were close to the clerical regime. Historically speaking, there are a lot of ties between the clerical institution and the bazaar. Following the sudden rise of the price of gold and also foreign currencies against the national currency and so on. And of course, the inflation, which deprived Iranians of purchasing power and so on. Now, middle classes in Iran who have from the 19th century onward been the bearers of or standard bearers of democracy or democratic institutions and freedom and so on are disappearing actually, because they are becoming increasingly impoverished, where as a minority in power and close to power continues to benefit from oil revenues, and they have grown richer and richer. And the Iranian economy is also something that continues to serve the interests of monopolistic structures run by those who are, again, close to the supreme leader and who do not even pay taxation. For instance, revolutionary guards and their foundations, including Khatam al-Anbiya. Then you have Astan-e-Quds Foundation, which is the richest of the country. Then you have other type of foundations. I'm not getting into the details. And so the protesters also refuse to let all revenues to be spent on maintaining the regime's support for the proxy groups in the region, but who have been largely weakened recently, but the Islamic regime still, of course, support them militarily and financially and so on. Now, what happens is that the regime, as you know, usually blames US and international sanctions for all of the economy's problems. But although it is true that Iranian oil sales have been affected by sanctions, but then the regime has always continued to sell its oil to China through different means. And what is really important, I think, and responsible for the current economic crisis is rather corruption and poor economic management rather than sanctions. I want to just quote the president of the Islamic Parliament Research Center, who stated in January 4th that combating the mafia network, it is him who talks, the mafia network that circumvents sanctions is essential to solving the population's livelihood problems. And he said that snapback mechanism and external pressures have not had a significant impact on the country's oil sales. So this is very important, and shows that contrary to the current regime's rhetoric or discourse that it is all the fault of sanctions, it is really the fault of this mafia network and the regime, not only sanctions. And then something else which is very, very contested in Iran is that 30% of the annual state budget is allocated to religious foundations. For instance, Imam Khomeini Foundation, Ms. Bayazid Foundation, theological schools, Friday prayers, imams, while the budget for health and education has continued to decline, depriving 1 million school children of education due to poverty. Because you have to pay to go to school. You have to purchase things to go to school, and they don't have the means. Now, the mismanagement of the economy and resources by incompetent officials has led to power, electricity, and other, as I mentioned, problems. And despite the very high financial, political, and human cost, nuclear power has not been able to produce electricity. So this makes the supreme leader's stubbornness in enriching uranium within the country even more apparent because the cost is very high and the society is hit by all this, but nuclear, civilian nuclear has not even been able to produce electricity. So we wonder why and for what reason they really insist to enriching uranium inside the country. The regime's response to the legitimate demands of the protesters, who have shown exemplary courage, has been fierce repression. A mass murder was committed this time by the regime. Tens of thousands were either killed or injured, and almost 50,000 people arrested. Among the killed people who were shot, 110 school children were killed. Many of them were arrested, and this is the Minister of Education that said it. Every Iranian I contacted in Iran, and including myself, knows somebody who was killed or injured or imprisoned. So this time really I should talk about a mass murder. The demands of real life freedom, that is freedom, secularism, equality between women and men, and ethnic and religious minorities with the majority have not been met, as this would lead to the end of the regime, because this regime is really founded on equality. But the people of Iran have grown closer together, and I would like to insist on that. And a growing number of women are defying the surveillance regime, as I mentioned. And the current movement and the mass murder is likely to deepen divisions within the ruling elite. Some promise economic reforms, including the president, Pezeshkian. But 47 years after the establishment of the Islamic regime, Iranians know well that structural economic reforms are not possible without changing the political structure. President Trump's threats of military strike, messages of support for the population from Mossad and Netanyahu and his candidate, Prince Reza Pahlavi, only benefit the Islamic regime, which accuse all protesters of being agents of the United States and Israel. It is up to the Iranian population to change the regime. And to me, only the continuity of social movements and the convergence of struggles across different social, ethnic, and religious groups can free the people of Iran from the stranglehold of a regime that has sacrificed the population and national interest to its own interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Azadeh, for this very insightful presentation. Daniel, the floor is yours to explain the foreign policy side of things.
Thank you very much. You can hear me clearly. Thank you. It's very nice to join you. I haven't seen Azadeh. She reminded me a little while ago in 20 years. Is this possible? No. And Christos, I think I ran into you on a small Greek island, not
Indeed, indeed.
which was very nice. And I'm glad to meet Assem. I was trained as a so-called Arabist, and working in the Middle East, particularly through my experience in the Arab world and in Egypt. And then when I was in graduate school, I fell upon Iran and fell in love with the place and the subjects and the politics of the society. And so I try to do both, even though I am trained in terms of the Arab world. I haven't been to Iran since it's been a while. No, in fact, it was 2020 that I was there the last time, I believe, but I'd have to take a look. It's been a while. So it's been a long time that I stepped foot in Tehran, and these were happier days when I was there. American could travel there without too much concern. This was the era of the reformists, of tremendous optimism, and of course, look where we are right now. I want to say a few things, first of all, about the regime and its contest with the opposition, because that will set up what I want to say about U.S. foreign policy, which is my brief for this morning. But I have to really link the two. And Azadeh mentioned Foucault, and Foucault had this notion of the disciplinary state. I teach Foucault back in D.C. I may be one of the only people on my campus who do, but I was thinking when I heard her that for Foucault, France was a disciplinary state, which only shows you that it didn't spend enough time in Iran if he really wants to see discipline. So, but I do want to talk about the nature of the regime. And one of the paradoxes of the regime, or maybe not paradoxes, is that over the decades, it's withdrawn into itself, and it shed all the political institutional sort of, assets it had to manage conflict and to process conflict. And the supreme leader is a kind of supreme adjudicator of these conflicts. He lost that capacity because basically the regime fell into itself and depended on the security sector and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards and many other parts of the security sector. There's 16 security institutions in Iran, right? Obviously, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, is the strongest, but it's become a security state. It was well on its way before the uprising. It's now clearly accelerating in that direction. And as a result of shedding the kind of political apparatus of the state and institutions such as elections and a parliament, which were not democratic, but provided the regime some means of mediating and managing conflict, the regime has nothing to fall back on except violence. So in some sense, its success as a repressive apparatus is its greatest deficit and danger, because it has no strategy now, no exit strategy, no negotiation strategy. And all it faces, especially in the wake of this rebellion, we don't know exactly how many people were killed, 5,000, 20, 25,000, hundreds of thousands of people, as I did mention this, wounded. Nobody in Iran doesn't have a relative or friend who are affected by this. So the regime is isolated. And I never believed, and I have to say this, as it makes me unhappy to say so, I didn't think that the opposition would prevail for reasons of a simple formula, and that is the opposition has nothing to lose and the regime has everything to lose. The regime has its claws on the economic apparatus, the political apparatus, the religious apparatus, the military apparatus, the security apparatus. And because it's so sunk into all these institutions, there's no way that anybody within the regime can imagine pulling the kind of deal, let's say, that the Trump administration in effect pulled with the leaders of Venezuela, some sort of trade, some sort of negotiation. And there's no room for that in Iran as well, because from the perspective of the supreme leader and his allies, any small reform is a slippery slope to oblivion. It's like being a little bit pregnant. You just can't, for them, and this is a gift they've made to themselves because they have nowhere to go. There's no reform strategy now that they can imagine. And so the regime is united. It has, and it's precisely because it is a minority regime. Minority by what I mean is it doesn't represent minorities, but I mean it represents a minority of the population. It's very well organized. It's unified. It's precisely because of that it prevails, right? Because for the regime to do otherwise is not to survive. So the regime used every ounce of massive repressive force it could to prevail, and it did precisely that, and it was very likely to do so from the beginning. I do think, and I've written about this recently, that in the long run, let's say 2 to 5 years, what this has done is it's set up a situation whereby the regime is going to face massive pressure, particularly when the supreme leader passes on. He's 86 years old. There's a question of succession. And I do think that the use of force that it's deployed this time will come back to haunt it, because eventually it's going to translate into some sort of tensions within the regime, some sort of defections. Now, defections could lead to a hardening of the regime or an opening of the regime. But this is not going to happen until we can see on the horizon that the supreme leader is gone. And this may be, I mean, he's 86, but he keeps on going. But I think in the next 2 to 5 years, it's going to be decisive. So if we're looking for the consequence of this rebellion in terms of shaking the regime now, we're not going to find any results. It's not going to happen, quite the contrary. But what this revolt has done is set the larger stage for, I think, transformations down the road. So I want to put that slightly silver lining on what is otherwise a very dark cloud. Now, let me say something about the role of the United States and Israel in this particular conflict, and the perspective, particularly of the Trump administration. There is one theory, and of course the regime exploited this, that this rebellion was partly prompted or magnified by outside assistance, particularly from Israel and from the United States. If this is true, this was a massive miscalculation, and shows that those who were behind this interference, it's yet to be really studied and proven and tested. But if it's true, this was a massive mistake, because any threat of intervention or actual reality of intervention only hardens the regime's determination to survive. So the threat plays directly into the hands of the regime and helps it to perpetuate itself. So if this is the outcalculation coming from Tel Aviv or from Washington, it's a tremendously misguided calculation, because precisely this kind of strategy plays into the hands of Iran, and so it makes no sense. I mean, unless you feel they're just going to get lucky. I think the Israelis, when they first attacked in June, and they tried to decapitate the regime, they were looking to do that. It didn't succeed. They did get a number of leaders, but it didn't do what they thought it would do. But I think it's important to underline that when the Trump administration then launched an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, Trump intervened and imposed a ceasefire, because he didn't want to pursue a wider war with Iran. He had certain strategic objectives at that time. And I think that the interesting thing to kind of grapple with when you're dealing with Trump is the extent to which, in his own mind, his own irrational impulses to sort of use foreign policy as a mechanism to project his own personal influence conflict with any notion of foreign policy strategy. They are completely opposed impulses. One is irrational and the other is rational. And understanding the interplay between these two impulses from Trump is the key to understanding U.S. foreign policy or U.S. Iran policy. I don't think Trump has a coherent Iran policy. I really don't. I think every day he gets up and he decides what to do and how to reinvent the world, whether it's to go after Venezuela or destroy part of the White House or take care of the Kennedy Center. I mean, both domestically and internationally, we find this president sort of lashing out wherever. And so it's very hard to read into this any kind of coherent policy, which, by the way, from the Israeli point of view, is not a good thing, because they have a strategy, whether it's right or wrong, but they can't depend on the Trump administration to abet that strategy. The notion that there's a kind of alliance between Trump and Israel in that sense on Iran is, I think, misguided. And by the way, I want to remind our viewers that when in the Gaza conflict, when Israel tried to assassinate leaders of Hamas and failed to do so in Doha, and I was there on that day because I was teaching last year on our campus in Doha, Trump was not happy about it at all and ended up negotiating a ceasefire with the very leader of Hamas that Israel had attempted to assassinate. If that is not an indication of where Trump is coming from, nothing is. He's really interested in, first and foremost, in Trump. And that is not necessarily a good thing. I think as we look at the possibility of Trump and the White House negotiating with Iran now on the nuclear file, as they say here in D.C., the negotiations were supposed to be in Istanbul, and now they're going to be in Oman. They've been there before. I think the chances of these negotiations succeeding are very, very slight, because they revolve around, first of all, I think it's been widely reported, it's probably true, that the site of Oman indicates that the Iranians are insisting that the negotiations will only be on one issue, and that's the nuclear question, not on ballistic missiles, not on Iran's wider role in the region, and is rejecting any pressure on that score. And not only that, I expect the Iranians to be very defiant and persistent in rejecting any notion that a deal is going to be based on excluding some sort of indigenous enrichment on the soil of Iran. And that is what the Trump administration is insisting as a precondition. Well, if that's your precondition, there can't really be a negotiation, right? That's not possible. I mean, we all would like to agree that we don't want Iran enriching uranium, but after the attacks in June by the United States, it apparently reserved most of its enriched uranium, still has it, probably can rebuild its nuclear facilities in 2 years with enough enriched uranium to create a bomb or two down the road, not so far maybe. If the position of the Iranians is that we have to protect our so-called right to enrichment, there's nothing that says they have a right, but that's another matter. But they insist on enrichment, and the United States says no, and that's the basis for a negotiation. It's not going to happen. I'm not sure what's going to happen in Oman. There are formulas. I'm going to stop here. There are formulas out there for squaring the circle. There are formulas for an enrichment kind of solution that would allow each side to come out of. That's what a negotiation is, by the way, that each side comes out of this by saying, well, okay, we got something. Each side feels it won and each side feels it loses. But I can't see them coming to this point. I think that we're going to see a persistence of the status quo. No negotiations. Sanctions will remain in place. The regime is going to further securitize. And I'll just conclude here, and it goes to one of the things Azadeh said. Iran is a country of mafias in terms of the leadership. There's an elaborate water mafia, among other things. The mention was made of dams before. There's an oil mafia. There's a gas mafia. This is a mafia state. And we feel elements of that happening only a few miles from here in Washington, the phenomenon of a mafia state. But of course, it's much worse in Iran. And the sanctions increase the power of that state, because the only ones who can leverage the sanctions through smuggling are the most powerful groups in Iran, who benefit, paradoxically, from the imposition of sanctions, because those sanctions allow them to control the flow of oil and to benefit in ways that the wider society can't. Meanwhile, sanctions weaken the middle class, and if there's going to be a sustained, successful rebellion and eventual some sort of negotiation between elements of the opposition and elements of the regime, it's not going to happen if you have a middle class that is struggling to survive, that wakes up every morning and has to sort of just do their thing. People have to survive. And so in some crazy way, all of U.S. policy really makes it very difficult to produce the precise kinds of outcomes we all would agree we want to see in Iran, which is a democratic state, a non-discriminatory state, a state that's at peace with the region. The U.S. policy provides no vision of how to help make this happen whatsoever.
Daniel, thank you very much for your presentation. And we welcome all the questions from the audience. Please put them in the chat box. I have one question for you, Daniel, and one for Azadeh. What is the position of the other regional powers, Daniel, regarding Iran? Do they really want to see regime change, or what is their strategy towards towards Iran? And for Azadeh, the question is more about the social movements and whether we can be hopeful of seeing consolidation of social movements, and whether or not, these democratic movements in Iran can find the transactional ties with other movements in the region. So I leave these two questions, and then we can see the others from the audience.
Well, the regional powers want to see the United States and Iran reach a deal and avoid war. I mean, it's as simple as that. The cost economically and politically to all the regimes in the Gulf, and I just spent a year in in Doha teaching at our campus, so I thought a lot about this. Qatar's been involved in these negotiations at different points, also in Gaza. We know from the press reports that these powers, one of which, Qatar, is very close, by the way, with the Trump administration. They've really been lobbying very hard for the Trump administration to back off. And they don't want war. They don't want an escalation. They fear it. They fear the economic consequences for the export of gas and oil could be tremendous. Iran is always sort of threatening that behind the scenes or even in front of the scenes. So I think that's what the regional powers want to do. They want to see a deal. They would probably be willing to accept any kind of face-saving arrangement on the enrichment issue they possibly can. And so that's what they want. And Trump listens to them because he has economic and diplomatic interest in doing so. The problem, of course, is that he doesn't have a coherent response in terms of how to deal with Iran as a strategy, just as a tactic.
Yeah, Azadeh. Assem, you may need to unmute Azadeh.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Excuse me, before trying to answer your question, Christos, I just wanted to say that I think, Daniel, that Iranians might accept to suspend uranium enrichment for some years, but nevertheless, they will never accept the missile, ballistic missile. I mean, to forget about the ballistic missile. And the issue here is ballistic missiles. It's not nuclear. According to what I could understand from their discourse prior to the negotiations. Although they say, we want to negotiate first, we don't accept any preconditions. But finally, when you read them, it seems that some of them argue that, well, we have already done this, remember the year 2000s, 2002, 2003, they suspended their uranium enrichment for some time and they think they can still do it. But nonetheless, they will never accept to forget about their ballistic missile program. And the argument is that Israelis will then attack us if we do not work on our missile programs. As to social movements, my understanding is that social movements do not disappear. The consequences of social movements are there. And when, for instance, you look at this very recent social movement, you have several other social groups that were not in women's rights movement, that they were not in necessarily in 2009 Green Movement, who joined in. In this current movement, you have both traditional middle classes, you have working classes, you have even bourgeois, some very bourgeois neighborhoods in Tehran also participated in the movement, and some of them were killed or injured as well. So you have rural people who joined in. So this is a synthesis of recent and other precedents, social movements. Nonetheless, the problem is that they quickly arrest the leaders of the movement. For instance, trade union leaders, student leaders, women's rights leaders, they are all in prison. And so there is no nationwide confederation of trade unions or anything like that. So unfortunately, this is what is happening even today. And for this very reason, you do have, for instance, strikes in petrochemical industry, but not in other industries, because they are not, as I said, there's no confederation, and so they're not necessarily tied together. But there are councils that are being created, there are associations, there are, again, some trade unions, and trying to resist. For the moment, the issue is to resist against the repression, but for the moment, we can't talk about the structures or institutions that are needed to topple a regime. And my understanding is that we cannot talk really today about a new revolution or the toppling of the regime from one day to the other, but I'm for the thesis of collapse of the regime. And the collapse of the regime will take time. It will not happen today, but the regime is being in the process of this collapse, and they have really lost their support. And I don't know up to when they can remain in power without any support from the population and just by military repression or, So the answer is open. I'm sorry, I can't answer necessarily to your question because this is an ongoing movement. People are still mourning. And for instance, as you know, we also mourn 40 days after the death of a person. There are ceremonies at the 40th day of the passing away of the person. And this is another moment where people can get together and so on. So this is a movement that will continue against the regime, against the power, and unfortunately with additional deaths.
Thank you. Two questions to Daniel and also Azadeh, regarding the proxies of Iran, Daniel. And these were considered for a while that this is the first line of defense of Iran, in face of Israel. Do you think that this extensive or this maximum pressure on Iran, and if things collapse with respect to the negotiations, would they try to firm up their regional position by basically supporting these groups, or these groups doing something for the sake of preserving the regime in Iran? Or will there be a pursuit of different regional strategy, especially that we've seen that these proxies, especially Hezbollah, was weakened significantly after the war with Israel? And the second also question, which relates to the region, with the Gulf countries, is it that they prefer to see a weaker Iranian regime rather than seeing a regime change with unpredictable consequences, or similar to what we've seen after the invasion of Iraq and the regime change there? And for Azadeh, a question change, I do believe change has to come from inside, but one of the questions that we received is there something that the Western or the external powers could do to help the social movement? And also, I would add to this, Iran has a huge diaspora that is very active. What role they can do also to help internally? Daniel, please.
Yeah, well, I think you're onto something there. I think that from the point of view of the Gulf states, these are stable states in the sense that they know how to create stability. I've witnessed it up front. I mean, they provide money, goods, services to small populations. Most of the work are done by foreign labor. Folks live and are born in very stable environments where they often don't have experience beyond their own countries, but the notion of stability and having a stable life is a kind of ethos in these countries. So the idea of instability in Iran, the breakdown of the state, I think there would, and the particular question of sort of the reaction of minorities who have been repressed, as Azadeh said, by this state since its creation and before, creates a real set of concerns. I'm not necessarily saying the state would implode, but there's that concern. And I think, yes, a weakened Iranian state that somehow survives and cuts a deal, it may be preferable to many of the kind of pragmatic leaders in the Gulf. As far as the regional equation, Iran's approach was, as they used to call it, no war, no peace. Use the regional equation and their allies in the region, in Iraq and Yemen, particularly in Lebanon, Syria, to make life difficult for Israel, to always be there with the capacity to retaliate if Israel would attack Iran. And that whole strategy was literally blown up by the Israelis and the Americans, and especially the Israelis. So Iran can't really depend on that no peace, no war strategy in which those forward groups are effectively helping to defend Iran and deter a strike by Israel on Iran. On the other hand, we can't really say that the capacity of these groups in Iraq and elsewhere, and including in Lebanon, to do harm and to strike back, has been so severely weakened that the United States has to disregard it. It can't do so, and it's very likely that under conditions of a war that threaten the regime would do everything it could to activate these assets, as they say in the business, these allies, and to punish Israel and punish American forces as best they could. So I don't think we should count them out. But yes, the regime doesn't have the outer ring of support. That's why, partly why, as Azadeh was saying, for the regime, hanging on to ballistic missiles is now a matter of survival, right? But of course, from Israel's perspective, an Iran that can create a nuclear weapon and has ballistic missiles is very threatening. So that's another part of the equation. So these things all add up to a situation whereby Iran's sort of options in terms of foreign policy have been constrained, but that makes Iran more violent and more, I think, more desperate.
Azadeh, please.
Yes. Actually, between military strike and doing nothing, there is a huge possibility for the Europeans, especially, to help the Iranian society. I think that the recent decision of the European Union to put the Revolutionary Guards amongst the list of terrorist organizations was a good move. And this was something that the European Parliament had already voted up 3 years ago, but the governments did not want to put Russian guards on the list. Now they have to also apply this decision and, for instance, freeze the assets of Revolutionary Guards and those who are in power and so on and so forth. That is financial pressures, international or at least European, American, Canadian pressures, financial pressures will work. Are likely to work for the very reason that a lot of these revolutionary guards, ordinary revolutionary guards, or ordinary military men who are in the streets and are forced to shoot and kill their own people are not necessarily profiting from the oil money. And I have, when I could still go to Iran and do research, I would see a lot of these. I had some of these Revolutionary Guards in my own research, and they were telling me that they had to work during the weekend to make the ends meet. So these people, if there is a very important financial pressure on Revolutionary Guards and so on, are likely also to make these divisions within the Revolutionary Guards, for example. Another thing is that we are very, very worried and preoccupied by the execution of all these political prisoners and also the 50,000 people who were just arrested recently. So Europe and again international community through UN should send commissions to see what's going on in Iranian prisons and to avoid and to prevent the execution of all these prisoners and also political prisoners. And we're asking for the liberation of all political prisoners. There are a lot of alternatives, figures, important figures who are imprisoned. So if they are out of the prison, they can go ahead and make and create a political alternative against this regime. Because my understanding is that political alternatives should emerge from Iran, not from Washington or Paris. Chalabi, we can't even imagine of having a second Chalabi in Iran. As to your question with regard to the diaspora, as you know, diaspora is very divided. Some parts of the diaspora are very much supporting Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah of Iran, who is also very much supported by Israel, by Netanyahu, not by Trump, but by Netanyahu, and also by a lot of media that are funded by Israel and also eventually other states. But he has no structure in Iran, and his followers in Iran, we don't know exactly, but one recent research showed that among the slogans that were chanted during the recent demonstrations, only 17% were with regard to Reza Pahlavi or supporting Reza or the Pahlavi regime. And you know that ethnic minorities such as Kurds, Baluch, Turkmens, and Arabs are not at all do not at all agree to work with Reza Pahlavi. So this is a major problem instead of a solution. Reza Pahlavi is a problem, and he should work with others to make a coalition, and he refuses because he says, I'm the son of the Shah and I should be the leader. And if you look at his program, it is just another dictatorial program because he gives himself all the power to name who is the head of judiciary, who is the head of legislative power, and so on, executive power, and so on. So, anyways, and unfortunately, the followers of monarchists are some of them, not all of them, but very fascist-like, I should say, people. They have no future. I think, but for the moment, this is unfortunately the state of things within the diaspora, very divided. They, for instance, organize different demonstrations when, and so on. So you can't count on the diaspora, but diaspora is very rich as well, and they can help. For instance, why not funding this strike? Funding for the people who are on strike we used to do it in 1979, actually, when workers in the oil industry were on strike. We helped them financially, we gathered money for them in order for them to continue their strike. So these are things that rich Iranian diaspora can do instead of, voila. But they are not really active in this matter. And there are a lot of divisions amongst them, yeah.
Since we're talking about also on the internal dynamics, like, is there any role for the social media and internet, despite the prohibitions, despite the restrictions? Like, is this kind of would it help strengthen the fight against the conservative, despite the restrictions? So, also, like, I don't know if you have any insights. Is there any way, because there was a huge the internet was cut, etc. Are there alternatives that are?
And
no, I mean, sorry.
Sorry, Azadeh. Yeah, you can start your answer to the question that Assem put, but also to Daniel. There is another question from Alex Christogiannopoulos, a former colleague at Loughborough University, about if there is any erosion within Iran, because states are very rarely monolithic entities. So Alex's question was whether or not, despite the fact that the regime has to put its claws on the system in order to preserve itself, what Alex asks is if there are any defections, any refusals to continue the repression, etc., etc. Yeah, Azadeh, you can start with the social media, the question about social media, and then Daniel can
as you know, social media in Iran as elsewhere in the Middle East played a crucial role in bringing people together and, for instance, facilitating discussions. But at the same time, the problem is that there are a lot of fake news that are diffused within or through the social media, and also who is more popular than others. Of course, if you have more money and you can employ more people, you will have more likes and so on and so forth. So these are also the problems of the social media. Another problem with the social media is that some activists in Iran, for instance, have totally forgotten about just face-to-face interactions, going toward other people who are not necessarily all on the social media. I don't know if I'm clear what I'm saying. And I saw this with regard to women, for instance. If you have access to social media, you can talk and you can join together. But how about those women who are also having a lot of problems but are not do not have access to the social media? And who when we talk about social media, the question of power is still there. We're talking about our societies, but also social media, and the question of power and who has the power within the social media is also very important. We should not forget about it, and so it raises also a lot of problems, but is also facilitating people's getting together or interactions virtually, of course. And so when the internet was closed down for 3 weeks, there was no interactions between us in the diaspora and them in Iran, and even within themselves in Iran, they didn't know what was going on and so on. So social media is important. And as you know, 70% of Iranians, according to the international stats, use internet and are on social media. So it is important that the social media should not be should be there. And also 4 million people in Iran gain their lives through internet. Through selling things on internet, all this virtual shopping stuff, and they were all bankrupt because for 3 weeks they could not buy, sell, or work. Actually, I don't know if I answered your question, but
Thank you, Daniel, please.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, the question about sort of fissures in the regime, typically, political scientists, we focus on that sort of issue, and the cracking of the regime is the term we use in the business. And I think that kind of, those sort of splits are going to come eventually. They may have been hastened by this uprising, even in a regime that looks unified. And Christos, you were getting at this. There are always going to be divisions of some kind. Now, the divisions are far fewer than they used to be because the regime has shed so many of its former allies. Just to take one example, Hashemi Rafsanjani, the former president, he was the spokesman for the bazaar. He was a pistachio millionaire. He had a network of universities, private universities. It's probably the case that the regime murdered him. This is widely suspected because he represented a real threat precisely for the reason we're talking about here. Now the regime doesn't have. I mean, the paradox is it doesn't have these sort of potential sort of mechanisms of finding an interlocutor with the opposition, and so those going to have to come out. And I think one of the reasons why the regime shut the lights off, as it were, shut down the internet, is if it were to be seen as doing a kind of Tiananmen Square and massacring thousands of people in the square in public, and the world were watching it and so on, not only will the world be horrified, it is already horrified, but even more so. Look what's happening with Minneapolis and the videos taken there and the effect on public opinion in the United States. If they had that sort of situation in Tehran, it's not only possible that you would have had a worldwide reaction much stronger than you did have, but also elements within the regime in the military might have decided, well, we just can't put up with being expected to kill so many of our brethren all the time, and might have hesitated to do so. But one sign that was clear from the beginning was the signals from the very top of the Iranian military that they were completely unified with the regime. They signaled very clearly that they understand what we're talking about, right? They understand it very well. And so they signaled that there was going to be no split between the security apparatus, the Pastoran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, and the professional military, which is a professional military. But they joined forces. So down the road, the possibility for these sort of divisions will appear. And the closer it gets to the prospect of the supreme leader moving along, passing, dying, or whatever, the more important these splits will become.
May I just say something that,
yes,
according to my information, the army did not shoot the protesters. The army was just stationed to so-called protect public places, such as ministries or banks or mosques and so on. But it was the Revolutionary Guards and the militia who really attacked, shot the protesters, not the army.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. One last question, and I think we're already over the time. It seems that a lot of the powers, or all the powers, are in the hands of the Ayatollah, and he calls the final decisions are in his hand. And we know that he's relatively old, so there will be a change at some time, whether it is when it's. But would a change in the Ayatollah allow for not a regime change, but some easiness or some openings with the opposition, or will it be sort because they talk about his son, or they talk about, or would it be almost something that will not change much, like business as usual?
Also, Daniel, you wanted to say something about the previous question, I suppose, or not?
I
If
don't
the
know who is.
military was in the position of being able to declare its solidarity with the rest of the security apparatus and not shoot, that was a perfect solution, because it doesn't want to be put in a position of having to shoot. And so, to some extent, this worked very well from the point of view of the regime. It was a win-win, because the military is not being compelled to do the dirty work, and yet it's publicly declared it's with the regime. So that's kind of, from its perspective, quite brilliant, strangely enough. I'm not one of these, the criminologists used to see who was standing next to whom in the Kremlin, and I'm not sure how to do that when it comes to the Islamic Republic. It's so opaque. I don't think Mujtaba, the son of the supreme leader, has any likelihood of succeeding his father. I doubt it. There are two possibilities. One is that there'll be some sort of candidate will just be a kind of adjunct of the security apparatus. That's a possibility. Another possibility is they'll find somebody who is sort of, who has a wisp of the kind of Rouhani-ish kind of former president kind of, and has some sort of legitimacy, and that could open up space. Iranian politics are, despite everything, are unpredictable. That's a possibility, and also the possibility of the regime collapsing is there too. So there are many possibilities, and the supreme leader is 86, and so he is going to pass on, and so this is coming down the road. But and this is something, of course, that the opposition must think about, and sort of how do you strategize that day as it's coming? What do you do, and how do you react, and how do you prepare yourself? I think that's going to be an important question.
Thank you.
Just wanted to mention that, of course, Khamenei is a very important figure, but he's not the only one. And without the support of Revolutionary Guards and also those who profit and benefit from his regime, he wouldn't have been that important. So I'm not sure who is making important decisions, whether it's Revolutionary Guards, the commanders-in-chief of Revolutionary Guards, or whether it's really Khamenei. Well, because he was also forced to accept and admit, for instance, to negotiate with the United States now directly on Friday, whereas he has always been very against direct negotiations with the states, for instance. So sometimes he's forced also to accept things. On the one hand, on the other, there are all these people who are really profiting from this mafia-like structures, and it's not just him alone. And then, unfortunately, if you look at the mullahs, their life expectancy is real high. It can go up to 100 years, and Iranians can't wait that much. So they want change.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think we've 20 minutes over time.
Yeah.
So thank you for your patience, and also thank you for your insights and for shedding light on such an important topic. And I think we will have probably another webinar on Iran, like once things are a bit clearer to see also how things will be on Friday and also in the coming few weeks. So thanks a lot, Azadeh. Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you all for joining us and for asking also questions. So have a
Thank
nice
you very much.